By the morning of July 1968, everyone who mattered already knew how this would end. Ellsworth, Bumpy Johnson, was dying, not metaphorically, not someday, dying now. His heart had been failing for weeks. The pain came in waves, tight, crushing, familiar. Doctors had warned him, friends had pleaded, enemies had waited, Harlem had watched. Because when a man like Bumpy starts to fade, power doesn't disappear. It circulates. That morning, Bumpy did what he always did. He dressed carefully, buttoned his suit, straightened his tie, walked into public instead of hiding in private, not because he was brave, but because he understood something most men never learn. If you're going to die, where you die matters. Across the city, word moved quietly. The Italians knew his condition, the streets knew his habits, and everyone understood the same unspoken truth. Harlem without Bumpy Johnson was about to become available. This wasn't about revenge, it wasn't about pride, it was about timing. For 30 years, Bumpy Johnson had done what no one else could, held a line, not with speeches, not with bullets, with boundaries. Harlem was profitable, but not open. Controlled, but not consumed. The Mafia respected that line when Bumpy was strong, but now he was weak, and weakness invites contracts. They didn't come with guns blazing, that would have been stupid. They came with paper, with money, with terms. Fine print has ended more empires than violence ever did. Inside the diner, Bumpy sat alone at his booth, back to the wall, eyes on the door. The way men sit when they know company is coming. The way kings sit when abdication isn't an option. What the Mafia believed, what they miscalculated, was that a dying man wants comfort, that a legacy can be purchased, that fear grows louder as the heart grows weaker. They thought they were walking into a negotiation. They thought he was alone. What they didn't understand was this. If Bumpy Johnson collapsed in that booth, with witnesses, with enemies present, Harlem would decide the story, not them. And in Harlem, stories don't fade. They hunt. This wasn't a meeting. It was a test of memory, of power, of who controlled the aftermath. And before a single word was spoken, the hunters realized something was wrong. They hadn't cornered a dying man. They had stepped into a moment that could destroy them. If you want the truth behind the legends, stories history softened and buried, subscribe. Some power survives death. Some stories were never meant to be told out loud. This is where it begins. To understand why Bumpy Johnson's final hours carried so much weight, you have to strip away the legend and look at the machinery underneath. Bumpy was not a saint. He was not a folk hero born clean. He was a criminal who understood systems better than most politicians ever would. For decades, Harlem's economy ran on invisible rails. Numbers, policy banks, backroom betting. Illegal, yes, but structured. Predictable, local. Money circulated inside the neighborhood instead of being siphoned off entirely downtown. That was Bumpy's real power. Not violence, not fear. He learned early that total domination invites annihilation, so he governed instead. He negotiated truces between Irish gangs, Italian families, and black operators. He paid cops when necessary, confronted them when possible. He absorbed pressure so Harlem didn't have to. And most importantly, he enforced a rule that never went on paper. No heroin. Not because Bumpy was moral, but because he was observant. He had seen what heroin did to neighborhoods that couldn't stop it. He'd watched entire communities hollow out, crime mutate, power slip upward and outward. Heroin didn't just make addicts, it made territories manageable for outsiders. Once heroin arrived, local control ended. That's why the Mafia wanted it. And that's why Bumpy blocked it. By the 1960s, the streets were changing faster than the old rules could keep up. Vietnam, civil unrest, younger hustlers with shorter memories. The demand was rising, the pressure was building, and Bumpy was aging. His heart wasn't strong enough for the life he'd built. Doctors told him to slow down, to retreat, to enjoy what time he had left. But retreat creates vacuums, and vacuums invite predators. The Mafia didn't fear Bumpy's strength anymore. They feared his absence. They knew once he was gone, Harlem would be up for negotiation. Not immediately, not cleanly, but eventually. And they wanted the transition orderly, profitable, quiet. That's why they didn't wait for the funeral. They went to him before the obituary. In their world, this was respect, an offer instead of an order, money instead of muscle. They believed Bumpy Johnson, sick and aware of his own ending, would finally do what every powerful man eventually does: choose comfort over consequence. What they failed to understand was simple and fatal. Bumpy Johnson didn't measure power by how long he lived. He measured it by what survived him. And by the summer of 1968, with his heart betraying him and Harlem watching closely, the line he'd held for 30 years was about to be tested one last time. Because when a man like Bumpy starts running out of time, the question isn't whether he'll compromise. It's who will blink first. The meeting didn't begin with words. It began with posture. Bumpy Johnson sat the way men sit when they've already decided the outcome. Still. Balanced. Back to the wall. Eyes forward. His breathing was controlled, measured against the quiet pressure tightening in his chest. Across from him, the visitors arranged themselves carefully, not close enough to seem aggressive, not far enough to seem afraid. Expensive suits, polished shoes, faces trained to look reasonable while calculating margins. They believed this was leverage. They believed time was on their side. The briefcase came next. Set down gently. Not shoved. Not flaunted. Just placed where it couldn't be ignored. Paper over bullets. Money over memory. This was how modern power worked. No threats, no shouting, just inevitability. They outlined a future where nothing changed, at least not on the surface. Harlem would stay Harlem. Names would stay names. Faces would stay familiar. The only difference would be what flowed underneath. New routes, new product, new ownership, invisible to anyone who didn't know where to look. All Bumpy had to do was stop resisting. He didn't reach for the money, didn't glance inside, didn't ask questions. That was the first crack. Because men who are tempted always look. What Bumpy studied instead was them, their breathing, their patience, the way one of them shifted too often, trying to outrun his own youth, the way another positioned himself near the exit, not for escape, but for control. Bumpy understood the room immediately. They weren't afraid of him. They were afraid of what would happen if this went wrong. This was not a negotiation over territory. It was a negotiation over narrative. If Bumpy accepted the money, Harlem would read it as surrender. Quiet, clean, transactional, the story would die with him. But if he refused, publicly, unmistakably, then the story would belong to the streets. And stories once released don't stay contained. The visitors spoke about markets, demand, inevitable change. They framed heroin the way empires always frame destruction, as progress with paperwork. Bumpy listened without interruption. Then he did something unexpected. He ended the meeting without raising his voice. No threats were issued, no ultimatums delivered. He made it clear, through tone, through stillness, through refusal, that there would be no arrangement, no partnership, no future where this poison entered Harlem with his consent attached to it. What unsettled them wasn't his defiance, it was his certainty. Because certainty removes negotiation. One of them tried to press the point, not aggressively, impatiently. The kind of impatience that comes from believing history has already chosen your side. That was the mistake. Bumpy shifted his gaze slowly, deliberately, letting the silence stretch long enough to expose the imbalance. He reminded them, not with words but with presence, that he had outlived men far stronger than them, that empires collapse quietly and legends don't. And then he gave them the truth they hadn't come prepared to hear. If he died with them in that room, the city would not ask questions. It would draw conclusions. They finally understood what he was holding. Not territory, not money. If Bumpy Johnson collapsed there, with witnesses, with outsiders present, every version of the story would end the same way. For them, Harlem would close ranks, law enforcement would hesitate, retaliation wouldn't need orders. The room changed. The visitors came in believing they controlled the future. They realized, too, late they were sitting inside someone else's ending. Bumpy's heart was failing. He could feel it now. A tightening. A warning shot fired from inside his own body. But his posture never broke. Because power isn't proven by survival. It's proven by what you can make others fear losing. The meeting ended without signatures, without handshakes, without victory. At least the kind that shows up on balance sheets. They gathered their things quickly, too quickly, already recalculating damage control. Bumpy Johnson remained seated, alone again, the line still intact. For now. But the cost of holding it was already coming due, and everyone in that room knew it. What happens next would no longer be decided by negotiation, but by consequence. The collapse didn't announce itself with drama. No final speech, no warning. Just a sudden stillness where control had been. Bumpy Johnson's body gave out before the city did. By the time help arrived, the outcome was already sealed. A heart that had carried too much pressure for too many years finally refused to negotiate. The man who had managed chaos for 3 decades was gone, right there in public, surrounded by witnesses, exactly where power becomes contagious. And that detail mattered. Word moved faster than sirens, not the medical kind, the political kind. 3 Italian men had been seen entering, 3 Italian men had been seen leaving. And a few minutes later, Harlem's gatekeeper was dead. No one needed proof. Perception filled the gaps faster than facts ever could. The Mafia understood immediately what they were up against, not retaliation, reputation. They didn't linger, they didn't test boundaries, they pulled back. Because in neighborhoods like Harlem, grief doesn't dissolve into silence. It hardens, it organizes, it remembers who was present when the lights went out. And for a brief moment, just a moment, the streets held their breath. 5 days later, the city answered. More than 5,000 people poured into the streets for Bumpy Johnson's funeral. Not quietly, not privately. This wasn't mourning behind closed doors. This was visibility, density, proof. The lines stretched for blocks. Old men, young hustlers, churchwomen, numbers runners, people who had never shaken his hand but had lived under the boundaries he enforced. This wasn't about forgiveness. It was about acknowledgement. The Mafia watched from a distance. They always did. Funerals like this aren't just memorials. They're intelligence briefings. They tell you how deep the roots went, how many people still care, how much resistance you'll face if you move too fast. 5,000 bodies told a single story. The throne wasn't empty. It was booby-trapped. After the burial, the city shifted, but not the way outsiders expected. There was no immediate takeover, no sudden flood, no clean transition of power. What followed was uncertainty. Local operators hesitated. Younger players tested limits and pulled back. Everyone waited to see who would step forward and who would be foolish enough to step wrong. That hesitation was Bumpy's final move. He hadn't stopped the future, but he had complicated it. For months the line held, uneven, fragile, but present. The Mafia advanced carefully, aware that Harlem wasn't just territory. It was a memory, and memory resists occupation longer than muscle ever could. Eventually, time would do what bullets couldn't. New players would rise without his discipline. New drugs would arrive without his restraint. The vacuum he feared would open, slowly and painfully. But it did not open clean, because when Bumpy Johnson died, he didn't leave behind an empire. He left behind a warning, a reminder that power doesn't end when the body fails. Sometimes it gets louder, sometimes it gathers, sometimes it stands in the street 5,000 strong and lets the world know you can remove the man, but you don't automatically inherit what he protected. And that is why, even in death, Bumpy Johnson remained a problem no amount of money could immediately solve. The king was gone. The consequences were just beginning. There's a version of this story people prefer to tell. The clean one. The one where the line holds forever. History doesn't work that way. Bumpy Johnson's death created exactly what he feared. Not instantly, not dramatically, but inevitably. A vacuum doesn't announce itself. It waits. It listens. It studies who is tired, who is impatient, who never learned the old rules. And eventually, it fills. The generation rising after Bumpy hadn't watched him negotiate. They hadn't seen him absorb pressure, so others didn't have to. They inherited the reputation, without understanding the restraint that made it powerful. They told themselves they were different, smarter, more modern. They believed control could coexist with poison. It couldn't. The drugs Bumpy had delayed delayed, not defeated, began to spread. Not all, not at once, not under one banner, but enough to change the rhythm of the streets. Crime stopped being structured and became desperate. Money stopped circulating and started evaporating. The very thing Bumpy understood, the way heroin destroys control, proved him right after he was gone. And still, something resisted. The Mafia never achieved total dominance in Harlem the way it did elsewhere. Not because they lacked muscle, but because the neighborhood remembered another way power had once been handled. That memory didn't stop the damage, but it slowed it, complicated it, forced outsiders to negotiate with ghosts. This is the part legends leave out. Bumpy Johnson didn't save Harlem. He bought it time, and time, in neighborhoods under pressure, is never meaningless. It allowed some families to escape, some kids to grow older before the storm hits, some local operators to resist being completely erased. His failure wasn't moral, it was mathematical. One man can't hold a line forever. The uncomfortable truth is this: Bumpy Johnson lost the long war, but he changed the shape of it. He forced power to move slower, to hide, to adapt. And in doing so, he denied his enemies the clean victory they expected when his heart finally gave out. That resistance, imperfect, temporary, human, is what history forgets. Because it doesn't look like triumph. It looks like a delay. And delay in a system built on speed and exploitation is a form of defiance most people never recognize. Bumpy Johnson couldn't stop what was coming, but he made damn sure it didn't arrive easily. There are men who build empires, and there are men who build limits. History remembers the first kind better. Their names sit comfortably in ledgers and court transcripts. Their victories can be counted, measured, liquidated. Bumpy Johnson belonged to the other category. He never believed power was about taking everything available. He believed it was about deciding what not to take and living. With the cost of that decision, that was the code. The code wasn't written, it couldn't be. Written rules can be exploited. The code lived in memory, in posture, in the way a man conducted himself when no one was forcing him to behave. It said, "Not everything profitable is permissible. Not every victory is worth surviving. Not every future should be allowed to arrive unchecked." That's why Bumpy Johnson remains difficult to categorize. He was violent when he had to be, criminal when the system left no legal path, protective without pretending to be pure. And when the final test came, when money, comfort, and time were placed in front of him, he chose consequence over compromise. That choice didn't save the neighborhood. It didn't stop history. It didn't prevent loss. What it did was leave behind an example that refused to disappear. In Harlem, old men still tell his story without embellishment, not as a saint, not as a monster, but as a man who understood that power. Without restraint is just destruction with better accounting. They don't repeat his words for poetry. They repeat them as a warning. Because once, just once, a man stood at the edge of his own ending and refused to sell the future for a softer exit. That kind of defiance doesn't fix the world, but it reminds people they're allowed to resist it. If stories like this matter to you, stories about power, consequence, and the lines men draw when no one is watching, subscribe to Untold Mob Chronicles. These aren't legends. They're lessons history never meant to teach out loud. Harlem doesn't bow.